The Black Power Hour with author, activist, and attorney Nkechi Taifa. Challenging and changing, coalition building, community organizer, forerunner of reparations, movement for Black Americans. The Black Power Hour discusses intelligent defense, sentencing, policing, prisons, voting, re-entry, clemency, racial justice, the death penalty, political prisoners, and critical issues facing our community. So get woke and stay woke with Nkechi.
The mighty Marcus Garvey, if you have ever seen, was the proud Black man with the red, black, and green. The mighty Marcus Garvey had a lot of pride. Millions of Black folk were on his side. He sailed from Jamaica to New York City. He organized a group in the 1920s, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. To millions was a great inspiration. He had the Black Cross nurses that worked so fine, the Black Legionnaires and the Black Star Line. The Black Star Line was the name of the ships. They would trade with Black nations and make many trips. The Black Legionnaires was the army to be. They trained to fight to set Black people free. The mighty Marcus Garvey had big parades. The foundation of our nation was being laid. The mighty Marcus Garvey had a lot of pride. Millions of Black folk were on his side. He said, African people were a mighty race, but we need once more a mighty land base. Let Africa be our guide and star, and then we'll know freedom won't be far. But some brainwashed Blacks turned up their nose. The racist court system says, Garvey's got to go. Back to Jamaica, he was finally sent, but as he left us with his hints. Look for me in the whirlwind, he said. Look for me in the storm. Look for me all around you, for my spirit will bring freedom to form. The mighty Marcus Garvey, if you have ever seen, was a proud Black man with the red, black, and green. Millions of Black folk were on his side because the mighty Marcus Garvey had a lot of pride, because the mighty Marcus Garvey had a lot of pride, because the mighty Marcus Garvey had a lot of pride. Bam! Karibu, and welcome to this episode of the Black Power Hour on Black on Purpose TV, where we bring to you news and views from across the Black nation. I am your host, Sister Attorney Nkechi Taifa, author of the best-selling memoir, Black Power, Black Lawyer, My Audacious Quest for Justice. And as demonstrated in my opening poem, our discussion today is going to focus on Marcus Messiah Garvey. Once again, the Black Power Hour brings to you a jam, power-packed show with commentary by me and experts on topics that will educate, that will illuminate, and that will break down false narratives that our people historically and currently are inundated with. And so it is and was with the mighty Marcus Garvey. I wrote that poem in the late 70s, amongst many others, highlighting freedom fighters from the past, which I published in a book. Bam! Shining Legacy, Story Points and Tales for the Young, so Black heroes forever will be sung. And guess what, y'all? Stay tuned. The book has been dusted off. The illustrations have been colorized and it will be republished this summer. So be on the lookout for the new revised color edition of Shining Legacy. I'm holding this now. This was the original 1983 edition. So why Marcus Garvey? Why now? We're going to be exploring that today, and we are going to dig deep. We're going to hear from the youngest son of the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey, Dr. Julius Garvey, who coordinated a 2016 press conference calling on the Obama administration for his exoneration. And I was happy and I was proud to moderate that press conference. And at that same press conference, we're going to hear from none other than the eldest daughter of El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, also known as Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz, their daughter, Ambassador Attalah Shabazz. We're going to hear about Marcus Garvey from Howard University, Professor Quito Swan and Goulda Downer, chair of the Caribbean American Political Action Committee. We're going to hear about it from Melvin Foote, founder of the Constituency for Africa. We're going to hear from Congressman Kwesi Mfume, and in a very special interview with attorney Justin Hansford, who along with Dr. Julius Garvey was the catalyst behind the legal case and the pardon petition filed for the exoneration of Marcus Garvey. But we're going to start out first, hearing some background from me. Stay tuned.
We are lucky to have with us today Nkechi Taifa from the Open Societies Foundations to speak about the deportation of Marcus Garvey. If you'll join me in welcoming Nkechi Taifa.
So the esteemed Professor Justin Hansford is one of the foremost scholars on Marcus Garvey, his movement, surveillance, deportation, and efforts at pardon. So I'm humbled to have been asked to sit in for him on this topic during his emergency away. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about Marcus Garvey, an individual I dare say many in this room have never heard about. Talk about why he was targeted, surveilled, imprisoned, and subsequently deported by the United States government, and measures today to clear his name. So of all of the movements that began in the early part of the 20th century, it was the Garvey movement that was the most personal to me. Was it because it was the most successful mass organization during its time and probably afterwards for the pride and confidence and hope of the Black community? Nope. Was it because the movement uplifted the critical importance of economic independence and the patronization of Black businesses? Nope. Was it because the movement laid the seeds and served as the foundation for just about every Black movement to come? No. The Garvey movement was most personal to me because it was in some way, shape, form, or fashion the movement that touched my grandfather, James Albert McIntosh, who was an immigrant from the islands, like Garvey, and he taught his son, my Uncle Ambrose, who was born in 1910, just to put it in chronological context, that was the same year that Harriet Tubman passed. He taught him about this man and his movement. Now, I never knew my grandfather because he passed when I was a baby, but I did know my Uncle Ambrose, who was a youth during the height of the Garvey movement during the early part of the 20th century. My uncle was not a militant, wasn't a race man, but like thousands of his contemporaries growing up in Harlem, New York, the Garvey movement was part of the ordinary course of affairs. You see, it was commonplace to see politicians and preachers and others honing their oratorical skills propped up on street corner soapboxes, and this is exactly what Marcus Garvey did. And my Uncle Ambrose, as a youth growing up amidst it all, being guided by his Caribbean-born father, he drank it all in. Marcus Garvey lives in history as one of the first leaders of the civil and human rights movement in the United States. He was born in Jamaica in 1887, witnessed firsthand the degradation of Black people worldwide. He traveled to the United States after being profoundly influenced by Booker T. Washington's autobiography, and Garvey later announced, and I'm quoting, he said, "I read Up from Slavery by Booker T. Washington, and then my doom, if I so may call it, of being a race leader dawned upon me. I asked, where is the black man's government? Where is his king and his kingdom? Where is his president, his country, his ambassador, his army, his navy, his men of big affairs?" And he said he looked around and he could not find them. And then he declared, "I will help to make them." That was profound. And he was ultimately punished quite severely for it. In the early 20th century, Marcus Garvey was an advocate for the social, political, and economic independence for people of African descent around the world. And to unite his followers, he founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, also known as the UNIA, which at its height boasted nearly 6 million members spanning over 40 countries. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, who laid a wreath at the Garvey Shrine in Jamaica, he stated, quote, "Marcus Garvey was the first man on a mass scale and level to give millions of Negroes a sense of dignity and destiny and to make the Negro feel that he was somebody." And Malcolm X said that it was Marcus Garvey's philosophy of Pan-Africanism that initiated the entire freedom movement, which brought about the independence of African and Caribbean nations. Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of an independent Ghana, stated, "I think of all the literature I studied, the book that did more than any other to fire my enthusiasm was the philosophy and the opinions of Marcus Garvey." Marcus Garvey's vision was not confined domestically. In 1920, he called for the first international convention of the UNIA with delegates representing all parts of the world. Several thousand black delegates came from the then all 48 states and from more than a score of countries spanning 3 continents. Among those in attendance were Ho Chi Minh, Kwame Nkrumah, Mahatma Gandhi, the Reverend Earl Little, Elijah Muhammad, all of whom would draw upon the teachings of Garvey at this convention in later years, fashioning struggles for victory around the world. Among those in the huge parades of Garvey during the early 20s were units of African legionnaires, the military arm of Garvey's organization. And although unarmed, many of them had World War I experience, and their presence made it plain that they believed in self-defense. Another uniform part of the UNIA at the Harlem parades were the Black Cross nurses, and the existence of the Black Cross nurses indicated the readiness of the UNIA to come to the aid of stricken people all around the world. And although outsiders may have ridiculed the elaborate procedures of the Garvey organization, none overlooked its importance in restoring the all but shattered black self-confidence. During 1919 and 1920, the UNIA grew spectacularly, and black masses responded by the thousands. Early in 1919, Garvey began to speak of a fleet of black-owned and operated steamships, which would link all African people and unite the black diaspora. This fleet of ships was called the Black Star Line, whose purpose, he declared, was to serve as a commercial and spiritual tie among blacks wherever his ships traveled. So, what happened? Where are the Black Cross nurses today? Where are the original black legionnaires? Where is the Black Star Steamship Line? And just what happened to the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey? Despite its success as a symbol of black economic independence and a recruiting tool for the UNIA, the Black Star Line encountered significant obstacles due to racial issues. And moreover, although bustling at the end of World War I, the entire shipping industry faced a downturn in 1919. Shipping companies, including the Black Star Line, failed. During that time, the Black Star Line and its competitors continued to advertise shipping voyages until the day the company ceased to do business. However, it was only Marcus Garvey who was the one charged with engaging in misrepresentation and trying to keep his operation afloat during the industry's depression. There was also opposition from Garvey's rivals in the black community. Garvey had an extensive grassroots network and was raking in loads of money and essentially cornered the personal contribution market. His rivals engaged in a vicious campaign to manipulate the public narrative about Garvey, and this smear campaign was coordinated in concert with the United States government. Permit me to share with you an example of one of the many reports received by the Military Intelligence Division of the United States Army. Quote, there is a man by the name of Garvey, in parentheses, colored, who preaches every night against the white people, generally from 134th to 137th Street and Lenox Avenue. Another example, on September 18, 1918, the Bureau of Investigation reported that, quote, a confidential employee, end of quote, had been inserted in Garvey's meetings who submitted reports and copies of the Negro World, that was the publication that Garvey started, with a warning that Garvey's activities must be closely watched. In 1919, J. Edgar Hoover was placed as head of the General Intelligence Division of the DOJ's Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, responsible for gathering evidence against radicals and immigrants the government feared were promoting communism. And in 1919, J. Edgar Hoover wrote a memo that Garvey, quote, was particularly active among the radical elements in New York City in agitating the Negro movement. Unfortunately, however, Hoover continued, quote, he has not violated any federal law whereby he could be proceeded against on the grounds of being an undesirable alien from the point of view of deportation. It occurs to me, however, Hoover continued, from the attached clippings that there might be some proceeding against him for fraud in connection with the Black Star Line propaganda. It is clear that for years before Garvey's eventual arrest for mail fraud in connection with the Black Star Line, Hoover pursued and targeted Garvey, and by early 1990, multiple federal agents had infiltrated his organization or befriended him. Sound familiar? Garvey was viewed as a threat. And decades before Dr. King would be targeted for his activism, J. Edgar Hoover led the Bureau of Investigation in its surveillance of Mr. Garvey and actively sought measures to disrupt and destroy the Garvey movement. Garvey became the first official target of what later became known as COINTELPRO, the FBI's once secret and quite illegal counterintelligence campaign to disrupt and destroy movements in general and the Black nationalist movement specifically. Never meant to be revealed to the world, these millions of pages of documents reveal what the Church Senate Select Committee, which later investigated the COINTELPRO, characterized as an orchestrated, coordinated war by the government against constitutionally protected activities. In 1923, based on intelligence gathered from undercover agents posing as Garvey supporters and aided by judicial proceedings that have largely been condemned as factually unsound and politically and racially motivated, Marcus Garvey was convicted of mail fraud and sentenced to the maximum 5 years in federal prison. As early as 1927, the U.S. Attorney General concluded that the case against him was unwarranted and untenable given the weak evidence against him. And in partial recognition of these facts, President Calvin Coolidge commuted his sentence in November of 1927, and he was promptly deported to Jamaica. A congressional inquiry and review of the historical record has led to agreement that Garvey was wrongfully convicted of using the mails to further a scheme to defraud. That conviction led to Garvey's deportation, effectively ended the movement which he spawned, precipitated his personal demise, and has harmed his family and community for over 90 years. So what caused the destabilization of Garvey's movement? The same thing that characterized movements before Garvey and after Garvey. The FBI memo stated that the goal of the COINTELPRO was to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, and otherwise neutralize the activities of Black nationalist organizations and groupings and their leadership, their spokesmen, their membership, and their supporters. And in their own words, the FBI memo expanding the program described the long-range goals of the COINTELPRO as, number one, to prevent the coalition of Black nationalist militant groups. Number two, to prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the militant Black nationalist movement. To prevent Black nationalist groups and leaders from gaining respectability. And a final goal of the FBI stated was to prevent the long-range growth of militant Black organizations, especially among the youth. And it goes on and on. You've seen it. I'm coming to a close. The Black community is still recovering from that unfortunate and highly successful enterprise. And there are still people languishing in prison who are victims of the COINTELPRO of the 60s and 70s. Although Garvey's sentence was commuted, His name is still tarnished by the stigma of his conviction. The Garvey family seeks to amend the historical record to reflect the esteemed nature of their ancestors' contributions to the global community. On June 27, 2016, an application for a posthumous pardon for Marcus Garvey was filed with the Office of the Pardon Attorney by his youngest son, Dr. Julius Garvey, on behalf of the Garvey descendants, Professor Charles Ogletree, Professor Justin Hansford, and Aiken Gump law firm, and I was honored to serve as part of the legal advisory team. Presidential posthumous pardons have been granted to correct injustices and heal societal divisions by restoring the unjustifiably diminished reputations of historical figures admired by their communities. Marcus Garvey was targeted because of his race, because of his political beliefs. He received an unfair trial, and he was unceremoniously deported. And efforts to fully clear his name have been ongoing and concerted on the part of the U.S. Congress, civil society organizations, cities, states, and international groups. The government of Jamaica declared Garvey its first national hero, bestowed the title of the Right Excellent to his name, and placed his image on Jamaican currency. The red, black, and green flag of the Garvey movement has become known as the flag of the Pan-African movement worldwide. So more than 90 years after the imposition of his unjust sentence, it is time to exonerate Marcus Garvey and let history reflect the true nature of his legacy. Thank you, Georgetown Center for Privacy and Technology, for including this important bit of history as part of this prestigious conference. Thank you. It now gives me great pleasure and honor to introduce to you the youngest son of the Honorable Marcus Garvey, Dr. Julius Garvey, at the historic 2016 press conference on the occasion of the 100th birthday of the Honorable Marcus Garvey, and upon the occasion of the filing of a petition for the exoneration of Marcus Garvey. And with that, it gives me great honor and presence at this historic and auspicious occasion to bring forth the youngest son of the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey, Dr. Julius Garvey, who I think was only about 7 years old when his father died. He spent most of his childhood in Jamaica. He received an undergraduate and medical degree in Canada. He came to the United States. It's important that people know he is an esteemed surgeon, a vascular and cardiac, surgeon. His decision, in fact, to become a doctor grew from the ideals of his family. But it's important to know the achievements of this great man who is the son of a great and mighty man who is simply seeking a sense of justice, but not only for his father, but for the era, the movement of which his father was a key part. So let's give it nice applause again for Dr. Julius Garvey.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Good. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for the turnout. And thank you, panel. You've covered the topic so well that there really isn't much for me to say. Perhaps I'll put a little icing on the cake, but not make a major speech. I had to grow up with the fact that my father was a convicted criminal, convicted in the United States of America, which is the biggest and the strongest country in the world, and boasts of its exceptionalism in areas of democracy and justice. And it was very difficult for me as a young man to reconcile what I knew about my father personally and what I knew about my father from my mother, who was his right-hand man, so to speak, to reconcile that with, quotes, a criminal conviction, when it was clear that he gave his whole life and even sacrificed his family for African people worldwide. As he said then, 400 million African people. Now we would say 1.2 billion African people. The largest, third largest number of people in the world, behind China, behind India, and then, of course, us Africans. From a geopolitical perspective, Africa is the richest continent in the world. I just mentioned our numbers, so our human resources are also of great significance. But what has kept us back has been primarily European invasion and exploitation. I don't have to enumerate that to you because it's very well known. The point, however, is that it continues despite the guise of equality, despite the guise of integration, despite the guise of the first black president, despite the guise of a post-racial society. I think we can draw a straight line over 100 years from when my father came to this country in 1916 to now, 2016. And young black men are still being shot in the streets in this post-racial era, in the largest and most powerful democracy in the world. I think there's a lesson here to be learned. I don't think we need dialogue. I think President Clinton had a racial dialogue to try to, quote, solve the problems between the races. But that was just talk and talk and talk, and nothing really materialized. I think what the Black Lives Matter movement is showing us is that our young black children are tired. They're tired of racism. They're tired of poor education. They're tired of lack of skills. They're tired of living in a society that marginalizes them and restricts their opportunities to be full human beings. That's the way it was when Marcus Garvey came to America. So what lesson are we going to learn from that 100 years after Marcus Garvey, 100 years after the philosophy of Marcus Garvey, the organizational skills of Marcus Garvey to bring us together as a people? You know, my father said, a people without a knowledge of their origin, culture, and history is like a tree without roots. That's one of our problems. We do not know our origins, our history, and our culture. We've been disconnected. That was the whole process of making us slaves. We didn't come here as slaves. We were made into slaves. And the process has continued in terms of our miseducation, as Carter G. Woodson has told us. And it continues. The young men in the street don't know their history. They don't know where they come from. They don't even connect necessarily with Martin Luther King, with Brother Malcolm. Everyone stands on the shoulders of those who have gone before. There would be no black president if it was not for the Civil Rights Movement. If it is not for Brother Malcolm. If it was not for Martin Luther King and the countless others. Many of you know their names, many without names. The Civil Rights Movement started with Marcus Garvey. That's acknowledged by Brother Malcolm. It's acknowledged by Martin Luther King. And it's acknowledged by anybody who knows history. The president stands on that foundation. Jomo Kenyatta met my father in England. He proclaimed himself a Garveyite. In his book, Facing Mount Kenya and Other Works, he told about the Negro World, which was my father's newspaper, arriving in Kenya. And the Kikuyu would stand around and listen while they read from the newspaper, the Negro World, memorize the articles, and then run off into the villages to repeat the stories. That fueled the Kikuyu nationalism that gave rise to the Mau Mau, that gave rise to the Kenyan nation. If there was no Kenyan nation created by the father, Jomo Kenyatta, the burning spear, there could have been no Kenyan national who came to the United States to study. So do you hear where I'm coming from? We stand on the shoulders of those who have gone before. This is a moment, this is a teaching moment for the president. He's very intelligent. He has a lot on his plate. But it's a moment when decisions have to be made. Directions have to be changed. Systems have to be reevaluated, not just words. It demands action. And that's why we're here today. And that's why we think it's the right time. It's the right time to join the dots between 1916 and 2016, because the system has not changed in order to give the black boy and the black girl dignity and their place in American society. So we think that the time is now to exonerate Marcus Garvey by a presidential posthumous pardon. And that's why we're here. Thank you.
This is indeed a historic gathering, a historic press release, 2016. We would now be honored to hear from Associate Professor Quito Swan of Howard University, who will share his remarks on Marcus Garvey. And we're going to start off our illustrious panel with remarks from Howard University Associate Professor of the African Diaspora in History at Howard, Professor Quito Swan, who's going to give us a perspective regarding Marcus Garvey. Thank you, Professor Swan.
Good afternoon. I'm great. It's truly an honor to be here, to be a part of this really important, illustrious event. Marcus Garvey's legacy is still being explored and understood in really important ways. It's hard to speak of Garvey in 10 minutes, because to speak of Garvey is to speak of the black world in the 1920s. To speak of Garvey is to speak about ideas of back to Africa, Pan-Africanism, that extends in the 19th century. To speak of Garvey is to talk about African resistance to systems of enslavement. Garvey himself would say he was a descendant of the Maroons. To speak of Garvey is to speak of black thought, of black men and black women that transfers into the 20th century, but it's these older ideas. Garvey's genius was his ability to build the world's most expensive black mass movement of the likes we have never seen since. The Negro World, for example, this amazing document, this newspaper that's not only written in English, but also French and Spanish, travels across the world as contraband material, which speaks to the assault on Garvey and the literature of Garvey and Garveyites for speaking about black unity, for speaking about the need for black people, like other populations across the world, had a right to self-determination. Some of these ideas will come during the civil rights struggle, will come through as commonplace ideas that organizations like the United Nations would speak for, the right of colonized peoples to have freedom. This is what Garvey was speaking about. The UNIA was this amazing organization. One of the reasons because it was family-based. It had a juvenile wing, very family organization that spread across the world, not just United States. Cuba, for example, had the most branches of the UNIA outside of the United States. Within America, while the UNIA is seen as a New York-based African-American idea, or West Indian idea is really much more expensive. Louisiana actually had the most chapters of the UNIA in America. Garvey hasn't reached Africa. You see UNIA chapters being formed in Southern Africa and being attacked by the apartheid-like regimes, also in what would now be Rhodesia, or right now is Zimbabwe. Garvey reaches Australia. In 1920, Fred Maynard forms an organization called the Aboriginal Australian Progressive Association, very much on the lines of the UNIA. They had tried to form a branch in Sydney through correspondence with Amy Jacques Garvey, who, when we speak of Garvey, must also be mentioned, as well as the number of other Garveyites who were also assaulted by the state and couldn't travel. They had passports revoked, visas denied, all these things that we look at now as being an assault on the rights of human beings. But the UNIA became this organization that these tactics of denial and assault are being practiced on in some way. As we know, the FBI's first black informant was used to infiltrate the UNIA, and the tactics that we used to attack UNIA were really out of bounds. But it's not unexpected, because the Garvey movement had this really phenomenal ability to galvanize black energy, black ideas for freedom. But back to Australia. This speaks to me to a lot about why Garvey was so powerful. The Aboriginal Progressive Association took its motto, one God, one aim, one destiny, which we know now that's Garvey. Through Garvey, we see people galvanizing around the attacks on Ethiopia by Italy in the 1930s, particularly through Garvey's paper, The Black Man. When we heard the words of Bob Marley, emancipate yourselves from mental slavery, for none but ourselves can free our minds, that's a straight quote from Marcus Garvey. His legacy has been ever present. Garvey's fueled so many other organizations, from the Nation of Islam, people like Septima Clark, this phenomenal educator in Louisiana, or South Carolina rather, speaks about seeing a Black Star Line coming into Charleston harbors in the 1920s and being really blown and transformed by this process. We still have Garveyites in places like Costa Rica, still remember this promised ship that entered this space. Garvey still lives with us in many ways, and so I think this event is really important, not just for the historical dynamic of how I look at Garvey, but as was stated, it's now a time to right the wrongs. Decades of scholarship, and there's a re-emergence of Garvey studies that is understanding the impact of Garvey across the world, clearly attests to the fact that this was a movement of liberation, this was a movement of legitimized struggle that should be seen as such. If we can speak of these things openly and have conferences on the UNIA, a multitude of books, scholars winning all kinds of prestigious awards for Garvey, then we should also address some of these same issues, I think, from a legal perspective. I think I'll end my comments with that. Thank you.
Professor Swan was so right. The Garvey movement had this really phenomenal ability to galvanize Black energy, Black ideas. And you know what? This ability was passed down to his followers, two of which happened to be the parents of our Black shining prince, none other than Malcolm X, and the grandparents of the person that I will next introduce.
I am so very honored right now to bring to the podium Ambassador Attalah Shabazz, the eldest daughter of El-Hajj Malika Shabazz, also known as Malcolm X, and Dr. Betty Shabazz. She is an actress, she is an author, ambassador, motivational speaker. She was 6 years old when her father was assassinated. And as so many people whose ancestry, I guess you could say, came from the Caribbean, as mine did, you know, as well. Her grandparents were crusaders for Marcus Garvey's organization, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. So at this time, let's give a warm welcome to Ambassador Shabazz.
We're going to have to update Wikipedia. Because I am no actress. So, you know, they take away your intellectual prowess by putting in something else. And somehow or another that has more life than it. I have my someone's piece here just so that I can read some letters that came to you earlier. And I ask you in advance to pardon me because, as I shared with Dr. Garvey over breakfast, I have dyslexia. So hopefully I can do justice to the letters that I'm writing. First, I'd like to say greetings to this distinguished assembly of people who found it significant to be here today. There were many, many others who I heard from hundreds of and couldn't be here as quickly, but were moved to know that this was happening at all. So I say that what doesn't take place today, that we continue, however the results are, that we do not let it rest, that what churns and moves and stirs, as we've heard thus far, has to have validity forever after, henceforth, no matter what. So that if not in our lifetime that this happens, we cannot let it rest. We always have to honor ourselves, no matter who else or whatever structure or systems in place. For I, too, am a child of that which J. Edgar Hoover surrounded, and that there are some of us around here. And because of memory being so short, people never know what it looks like, what we look like, what we walk like, what the inside of our systems feel like, what underneath our clothes and upon our skins, the keloids that are there as the welts. You know, just because we have such a passive coexistence, we have a political correctness, we have an ease, and that you can actually tell truth and not malign. You can actually update history and not offend. You can assure it. It is up to us to do that. So whether this exoneration or political pardon or presidential pardon takes place formally, we have to make sure that our voice is always defined no matter what. No matter what. So I am really moved. This is, as it was yesterday, Marcus Garvey's 129th birthday. Yesterday was Dr. Julius Garvey's birthday. I won't say how many years. It wasn't 129.
Say that.
Charming as he is.
I no longer have birthdays.
Yeah, but I called you. So, and I'm here just in a matter of hours from just returning abroad, because there was no other place for me to be, because and standing here in honor of his father is like standing here in honor of my own. And in standing in honor of my own is like standing in honor of all the fathers who dared to walk and climb that trajectory that is always put before them. But we do get there, right? So even if it's afterlife, our presence, our capacities, that which soars and reigns about us, that we whisper for some reason or another because it seems to be more humble, but we cannot allow our royalty to be hampered. It can't happen. So if we're speaking about Marcus Garvey 90 years after he's passed or 80 years after he's passed, it means that there's something in the soil, something in the air, something in the spirit, the voice, the generations later, where the magnificence of that time and the value of the diaspora that sang on those plantations, that hummed those nurturing lullabies that assured that our freedom would be what it is, that we would have continued messages to pass on to our children, that we'd have a backbone of strength to example to our children. But we got to talk about it so that young kids who are 30 don't have to advocate Black Lives Matter. They can just say, see what I'm talking about? We have to connect the dots so that they're not doing it out of nowhere, so they're not feeling helpless or hopeless, that they don't have to say it over and over and try to convince somebody that Black Lives Matter. So it means the person that's 50 and 70 and 90 has to speak up. That means we have to connect the dots so that the 30-year-old and under is not having to fight this fight alone. So I am the grandmother of that age. And I'm fatigued. There's a siphoning that takes place. There's a hemorrhaging that takes place. And so that this is the kind of thing that churns the spirit, that affirms the voices of those who've gone before us, that makes sure that I, as a younger sister to Dr. Julius Garvey, make sure that he doesn't walk and breathe on this earth without feeling the accompaniment of somebody advocating on behalf of the validity of his father. Some of you may wonder, what does Shabazz have to do with Garvey? And the story begins in 1916 when a young woman, a teenage girl from Grenada, was duly inspired by his message. With the support of her father and mother, she set sail to Montreal, Canada, where her uncle was a member of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. So I say all of it, not just the acronym, so that we hear and understand what it intended. The Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, everybody can fill something in with that. We want to be clear about what that meant. Following her position as translator of 3 languages, English, Spanish, and French, she soon became the author of the Negro World newspaper, where she and an African-American man, tall, handsome, at one of the conventions, who was also a presidential chapter in the United States, the two of them met. Long story short, she was my grandmother, he was my grandfather, my dad's parents. As children, my father talked about how the household that they lived in was absolutely defined by, rooted by, foundationally set in the values of being heirs of the African diaspora, and not comparatively. You understand? So it wasn't based on the outside. It was just simply so. So that was passed down. And sometimes, as we've learned in history, there's a price to pay for pride. So as we gather on this day and get a chance to listen to others and have an exchange, I am just hoping that we don't stop here. When they talked about inviting me to Grenada for the Emancipation Day, and or acknowledging my father or erecting something for my father, I said, you can't, he's one of 8. You got to do it for that little girl who was inspired. You have to do it for that person who thought that in that early day in her life in 1916, that I mattered, and the people from whom I come also have value, and got on that boat and came here. So much so that the Malcolm you think you know by way of something else is not so. So we have to be clear about how our history is told, even by us. It's really the root self by this global sense of who you are. Not up from slavery, pre-existence of the slave trade. That's when the root is unfeathered. That's when the powers that be here don't get to define it or refine it or give it back to you, because you have to know yourself before. So the going back to Africa movement was not just about the geography of it. It was about here. It was understanding that. No matter what the blends may have been in the Western Hemisphere, no matter what the experience had been in the Western Hemisphere, that knowing your root self, the value of that, really had some significance. And so I said to them, there's just no way for me to come down there and just wave a flag, because my grandmother was born there. If we're going to talk about the story, let's bring in the root of the story. And that's when I contacted Dr. Garvey and said, will you join me? And it was just wonderful for 2 children to share in that union. To know the stories we know, the sentences that we can complete for one another, and still have an affirmation to make sure that this legacy moves forward for our children, the direct legacies, and then the global legacies of men and women, such as Marcus Mosiah Garvey. So on that note, I will close, and I'm sure we'll speak later. Thank you.
At this time, it gives me great pleasure to bring to the podium Dr. Goulda Downer, who is chair of the Caribbean American Political Action Committee.
Good afternoon, everyone. I decided to document my notes because I did not want to make any errors. Today, we continue to honor the life and legacy of Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who not only devoted his life to a tradition of struggle, but the product of whose work and sacrifice we still acknowledge today. As chair of the Caribbean American Political Action Committee for this region, and on behalf of the millions of persons of Caribbean descent who call America home, we stand in unity and full support with the family of the Right Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, the first national hero for Jamaica, as well as well-known as one of the first leaders of the civil rights movement here in the U.S., and his family, and by extension, people of the Caribbean and the wider African diaspora who seek to restore his good name through a posthumous presidential pardon. A champion for social justice, basic human rights, and human dignity, who reminded us, for our senses had been dulled under the oppression of torturous, cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. He helped rekindle that knowledge of our individual and collective humanity as a race, of our power, of our genius, of our right to be here, reigniting the embers of wishing and hoping into a fire of doing, thus helping us pave the way for us to again build from worn-out tools. His drive for economic empowerment, for self-actualization, for self-pride was rekindled, and it was remarkable. Brave enough to struggle, often at his own peril, he worked tirelessly against forces and was able to bring vision and confidence to life. As a child growing up in Jamaica, I heard the name of Marcus Garvey. It was synonymous with self-pride, self-determination, and of my right to be here. We were told about him in kindergarten and read and studied about him in high school. And as I became an adult and migrated to America, my level of consciousness was heightened further as I realized the struggle he must have felt as I got sustenance for my own journey here. He had a vision in the worst of times, a vision for not only African Americans, but those of us in the Caribbean and the world over who are marginalized, abused, and vulnerable. The pride you see in our educators, our students, our politicians, our athletes, like our Bob Marley, a Maurice Bishop, and Usain Bolt, a Shelley Ann Fraser, exemplifies what we were taught in school, self-pride. As my math teacher, Mrs. Hector, used to say when we got ready to do our exams and they were difficult, she'd say, up, up, you mighty race, your own accomplishment, what you are. And let me say that again, up, up, you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will. And we went in bold as ever, although some of us didn't study. Those words, though, served as wings beneath our wings. It confirmed that regardless of our stations in life, even as children, if we took pride in our work and added the discipline of studying, we would be successful. And mostly, we were. We passed those very challenging exams and continued climbing the ladder of success towards our academic goals. And sometimes when we wavered in our quest, our English teacher would remind us that everyone in our class was destined for greatness. She would tell us again, a people without knowledge of their past history, their custom, and their culture is like a tree without roots. And then she would say, and that's Marcus Garvey saying, and then she would say, you are deeply rooted. Marcus made it so, and we believed. So today on his birthday, and influenced by his work that has continued to live on in us, in all of us, we would be pleased if the President would grant our wish and issue a posthumous pardon to a man for all the world. Thank you.
Up, you mighty race. You can accomplish what you will. A people without knowledge of their culture is like a tree without roots. Africa for the Africans, both at home and abroad. Those were quotes from the Honorable Marcus Garvey. You know, there were many, many people who wanted to be at this memorable 2016 press conference. Amongst them were actor and activist Danny Glover, who couldn't seem to be in two places at the same time. You know, this was like 5 years before the pandemic, when we could be on Zoom and we could be here, there, and everywhere all at the same time. Well, it was before then, so he wasn't able to make it. Judge Greg Mathis, our Black Shining TV judge, who said that Garvey was a major factor in his journey from jail to justice. The Honorable Brenda Hood, who's Minister of Culture and Heritage, Grenada, West Indies. Dr. Ron Daniels of the Institute of the Black World 21st Century, who was speaking at a Garvey celebration internationally at the very same time. All of these people sent messages and words of inspiration and of acknowledgement. Congressman John Conyers, Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, who both also sent statements of support, which were read at that press conference. But Baltimore Congressman Kwesi Mfume was in the House. He was in the audience in strong support of the exoneration of Marcus Garvey.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to call upon the Honorable Kwesi Mfume if he has any brief remarks he would like to make.
Thank you very much. I was trying to hide out back here. Didn't work. Dr. Garvey, it's an honor, sir, as I said to you when you came up to me, and there are just thousands and thousands and thousands of people who you will never meet who have been touched by your dad and now feel a sense of kinship to you and to this movement. I don't know that I have much to say. I'll try to be deliberately redundant and maybe add a little more icing. You know, I grew up in this country in a segregated society. Didn't know what it was like to see what I see today. This was before the Brown decision. You know, I'll be 68 years old in a couple of months, and so like you, I don't have birthdays either. It's just a commemoration of my mother's labor annually. But Ambassador Shabazz contacted me and was trying to give me a sense of how this was going to unfold, and I just knew I needed to be here. Mel Foote and all the others who have spoken have done an excellent job in underscoring the illegality of what has taken place. We all know that J. Edgar Hoover was a monster. There's no other way to put it. And so these trumped up charges against both Dr. Garvey and others represent a long line of patterned, deliberate behavior to judge, disrupt, and take away the credit of individuals who, at different points in our nation's history, particularly in the 1900s, worked so hard to bring about a sense of liberation, dignity, and pride for people of African ancestry. I was there in 1987 as part of the congressional hearing that we had as a member of Congress then to try to bring attention to this. And I want to commemorate Dr. Garvey's birthday with all of you by pledging that all of us who are here now, who have the facts, who have the links, who are connected to communities, will work to do everything we can to get this done. A good point was made. Legally, there is not much more that can be done. This is a battle now that moves to the court of public opinion, getting people in the streets, whether it's the Black Lives Movement, whether it's members of both political parties, whether it's our social clubs and fraternal organizations and professional organizations, to get on board in a very massive way so that we're able to call attention in the court of public opinion to a case that needs to be resolved. We were all taught as children that there is a time and a place for all things. This is the time, the place, and the season for this exoneration to occur, and I'm just glad to be a part of it. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. It's really great to be here, and Congressman, it's great to see you. You know, we miss you. We really miss you a lot. I represent an organization called the Constituency for Africa, and as the name might imply, we work to build public and private support for Africa in the United States. I've been working on Africa my whole career for more than 40 years now, Peace Corps volunteer, and worked with AfriCare for many years and formed my own organization, which turned 25 last year. So, but we're working to build a base of support for Africa in the United States. Dr. Betty Shabazz was one of my closest supporters in the early stage of CFA, came to several meetings, and I was always shocked to see her, you know, because I'm saying, wait, she gave me a big award with the links, had me 1,000 links out there, and gave me the International Trends Award. So I miss her, you know. So let me say this. We're an action-driven organization, you know. We don't think about agonizing, we think about organizing. Whenever I see an injustice, I think about what we're going to do about it. You know, that's my first impulse. I don't claim to be a great historian. I don't claim to, I read a lot of the books. But, you know, when I see something, I think, so Dr. Garvey and I have traveled quite a bit. If you want to know about Marcus Garvey, you go with his son to Trinidad. We were in Trinidad 2 years ago, and man, the whole place turned out for him to honor Marcus Garvey. 2 months ago, we went to South Africa and Namibia, and the whole place turned out for Marcus Garvey. And so while many of us don't know, many of us have forgotten, the rest of the black world knows, you know, and they admire Marcus Garvey. And so for me, the Julius called me a few weeks ago and said, look, I want to get this done. And he said, Mel, can you organize Washington? I said, I'm getting ready for my own conference next month, and everybody always lays stuff on me. And so I said, gee, well, what are you putting on me now, Julius? And so, but I just want to say, sometime when I came here and I saw what this is really about, you know, what we really are talking about, you know, don't agonize, let's organize. I'm thinking about what is the strategy going forward, you know. So I'm going to help to, you know, get this pardon done. It's a matter of, I'm saying, I don't know why it hasn't got done. Barack Obama certainly would endorse what we're talking about here today. Maybe we haven't pushed the right buttons. He is trying to save the world and trying to get us, keep Donald Trump from taking over and all the other kind of things that he do in the course of a day. But I know his heart and his spirit is there, and so it's a matter of how do we go about positioning it. And for me, it's not, if it doesn't happen this year, it'll happen next year, it's going to happen, And when I look at American history, and I do a lot of history reading, Elizabeth Wilkerson's book, and I'm reading one now by this brother about the half has not been told. And they just tell you about where we are in this country. I'm not surprised that Marcus Garvey encountered what he did. I'm not surprised that they locked him up, that they pushed him out of the country. I'm not surprised whatsoever because he was organizing black people. And I'm convinced that if Marcus Garvey was alive today, this pardon would have been done. There's nobody in our business who could organize like Marcus Garvey could organize, And so that's part of the problem. We don't have the organizing capacity that Marcus Garvey himself represented. So I'm convinced of that. So I think that this is a great day. This is absolutely a stunning panel here to outline the issue, and I commit myself to do what I can, Julius, to help get the pardon enacted. If we could do it before Obama leaves office, that'd be great. But if we have to do it after he leaves office, we'll do it. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so I want to thank everybody for coming, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
A reporter asked a question if there was any other benefit to Marcus Garvey being exonerated besides clearing the record. Let's see what Dr. Julius Garvey has to say about that.
The extra benefit is to legitimize the person and the ideology. It's sort of like coming out of the closet. You don't have to whisper, I'm a Garveyite, you can say, I'm a Garveyite. There's a difference. And I think a lot of people, because of the stigma, so many people come up to me, my father was in the organization, my uncle, I grew up, within the organization. We used to go to meetings on Saturdays, Sundays, and so on and so forth. But they're not out front. It's that kind of a whisper thing because it's not quite proper within American society. Even necessarily within Caribbean society, it's not necessarily proper. So there's still something subversive about the idea of Garvey, and that has to be lifted. That will be part of the byproduct of this, because we will now be going on the campaign to sort of spread the word again 100 years later of what Garvey stood for, what he meant, and so on and so forth. And we would like this, as somebody mentioned about the hashtag, et cetera, and Justin mentioned, it needs to be a grassroots movement. And I think Mr. Mufumi also mentioned out there, we need organizations, we need different social groups, we need individuals to sort of, as Bob Marley would say, get up, stand up. Okay, and stand up for our rights as African people. So we're going to be going very, very public about this and asking for support from all Africans, wherever.
I am just so very proud and pleased to be able to interview my colleague, my friend, Professor Attorney Justin Hansford. Justin Hansford is a Howard University School of Law Professor of Law and Executive Director of the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center. He previously served as a Democracy Project Fellow at Harvard University, a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center, an associate professor of law at St. Louis University. He has a BA from Howard, a JD from Georgetown University Law Center, where he also was the founder of the Georgetown Journal of Law and Modern Critical Race Perspectives. He earned a Fulbright Scholar to study the legal career of Nelson Mandela, served as a clerk for Judge Damon Keith on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. Professor Hansford is a leading scholar. See, I only bring the experts up here in the Black on Power Hour. Leading scholar, but he's also an activist in the areas of critical race theory. Got to have you back one talk about that, because that's all in the news today, trying to change the narrative and focus, throwing shade on critical race theory. But he's an activist and expert in those areas: human rights, law, and social movements. Co-author of the forthcoming 7th edition of Race, Racism, and American Law, etc., 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 ABC 1, 2, 3. But what I want you to know about him also, besides Marcus Garvey, which we're about to get to, but in the wake of the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, actually Justin lived about 10 minutes from where that killing occurred, but he's been working to empower the Ferguson community through community-based legal advocacy. He was the mover and shaker of the Ferguson to Geneva trailblazing initiative. Human Rights Shadow Report accompanied the Ferguson supporters and protesters, Mike Brown's family, to Geneva to testify at the UN. He's testified all over. In fact, you and I both testified before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. You opened that door. I appreciate that. But more so, I think I met you at a National Bar Association conference in Baltimore shortly after you had written your critical law review article or dissertation, whatever it was, on Marcus Garvey. And my eyes just lit up. I said, yes. So welcome, Professor Attorney Justin Hansford. How you doing, my brother?
Good, good. How are you doing? It's always an honor to be able to talk with you, and I'm really happy about this new production and show that's happening that you're leading. And I know many people are going to benefit from it. So it's really an honor to be involved with this interview.
Well, I really appreciate this. Marcus Garvey always talked about Buy Black, and Black on Purpose TV is a subscription streaming service. I hope people take this opportunity it's right there in your lap. Buy Black, blackonpurposetv.com. But Justin, now you were at that historic 2016 press conference that we saw clips from a little bit earlier. Indeed, you were the catalyst. You were the mover and shaker, along with Dr. Julius Garvey, of the pardon petition filed to exonerate Marcus Garvey, which was actually why the press conference was held in the first place. Can you tell us about that petition, what the charges against Marcus Garvey were, why they were bogus? Talk to us.
Definitely. Well, first of all, I have to give all of the props to Dr. Julius Garvey, the youngest son of Marcus Garvey, and he has been working on exonerating his father, I think, for most of his life, probably 5 decades or more. This most recent effort in 2016 was something that built on the legacy that Dr. Garvey had already established, speaking directly to the case, not for a pardon, but for an exoneration. I want to start off by making that distinction.
Make that difference.
Many people are have been concerned because a pardon seems to insinuate that the person was guilty, and now through beneficence or generosity, the president would pardon that person and sort of let them off. But in the case of Marcus Garvey and his conviction for mail fraud in 1923, it was a frame up. He was never guilty to begin with. So really what we're doing is we're exonerating him. Unfortunately, there's no mechanism for there to be a exoneration through the law. So we have to ask for a pardon that makes it clear when it's written that Marcus Garvey was innocent from the beginning. So what was he innocent of? So essentially what happened, and we're going to talk about this more in depth later, I think, when the Black Star Line was created, and as Marcus Garvey's movement for Black power and Black pride began to take over the world, there was an effort to stop him at all costs. That effort included the US government and the actions of one J. Edgar Hoover, who he's a major player throughout the rest of the 20th century's efforts to shut down Black liberation movements. And he really got his start. At this point in time, in 1919, 1920, he wasn't the director of the FBI as of yet. The FBI didn't even exist as an entity, but he was a young agent who was moving up through the ranks using this case against Marcus Garvey as his stepping stone. So what they did was they looked for different ways to try to stop his movement. They tried to accuse him of different crimes. They looked for ways to go after him for something called the White Slave Act, going across lines with his mate. This is what they did to Jack Johnson about 10 years earlier. Right? And he got pardoned by Donald Trump. The same thing where Donald Trump, I believe, said that was an exoneration, not just a pardon. They tried to get him on tax issues, but finally, ultimately, what they decided on doing was arguing that the Black Star Line was a Ponzi scheme. And essentially what they were saying is that the Black Star Line was never meant to be successful. It was just meant to be a ruse that would take money from other Black people, particularly effective because, number one, it paints this narrative of Garvey not only as someone who is a criminal, but someone who was trying to swindle his own people. And number two, the other element was in that particular time, people may know Marcus Garvey was in conflict with W.B. Du Bois and the NAACP and other Black organizations. And that conflict became so hot that the Black Star Line became a point of contention, and they knew that these other Black organizations would, in many ways, step back and not defend Garvey if they went after him on the grounds of the Black Star Line. So it was a politically effective approach for those two reasons. And then finally, you had an all-white jury. This is 1923, all-white jury.
Well, we have that in 2000.
Yeah, 2021, right? White prosecutor, white judge, of course. They were much more direct in those days. The prosecutor opened the trial by saying, gentlemen, will you let the tiger loose? Talking about Marcus Garvey, like, do you dare to allow him to go free and do all of his work? And essentially, the argument was this had to be a fraud because there is no way that a Black man could create a fleet of ships, a shipping fleet, and take people to Africa and ship goods back and forth. That's impossible. Black people are too inferior to do this. So it had to be a fraud for him to try to say that he could create a Black Star Line of ships that would be something that could increase commerce between Africa and the Caribbean and Black people in the United States, and even allow people to repatriate. That's impossible for a Black person to do that. So on those grounds, this idea that what he was trying to do was impossible for a Black person to accomplish, they said, yeah, it must have been a fraud, there's another element I can add to that. This is 1921, 22, 23. If you think back to history, only a few years earlier, World War I had ended, right? All of those warships that were used for the war were now just floating around on the water. Nobody had use of them. So it was a great idea to start a shipping company at that time because you could get a ship very easily. The problem is everybody else was thinking the same thing. So there was a marketplace that was very difficult to be successful when it came to shipping goods because everybody had those old warships to use and the market was going haywire. So it's true that the Black Star Line was not economically thriving at that time. So they had the fact that the Black Star Line was having trouble economically. There was doubt as to whether Garvey could do it. All in all, they said this whole thing must be a fraud. And so we're going to convict him of running a Ponzi scheme. And the actual claim, the mail fraud claim, is simply a hook saying that, well, when you advertised your Black Star Line using the mail, you're using the mail for fraud, and that's a federal offense. Gave him the stiffest penalty possible, 5 years in prison, hefty fine. Ultimately, he was deported, and he never came back to the United States after that. And the movement was essentially stopped because of that. In the way that it was growing with millions of people, it was really interrupted because of that. So this is something that is a historic wrong that was not only a wrong against Garvey himself or his family, but all of us Black people, not only in the United States, but throughout the world, who could have benefited from Marcus Garvey's vision reaching a greater level of fruition with the success of the Black Star Line. There are also reports that the Black Star Line itself was sabotaged by some of those agents that infiltrated the UNIA. The first Black FBI agent ever hired in the FBI was hired to infiltrate Garvey's organization. We have 10 volumes of the Marcus Garvey papers written by Robert Hill, which is a collection of notes taken by FBI agents who had infiltrated Garvey's movement. So we have more information on Garvey than we have on Dr. King's meetings, Malcolm X's meetings, and any other people, just because the agents did such a thorough job of infiltrating and taking notes, 10 volumes of FBI notes essentially on Garvey. So there was a huge operation to stop him and to surveil him. And this was the culmination of that operation.
You know, this is just makes my blood boil. I mean, when you even look down through today with the COINTELPRO, the FBI illegal one secret program to disrupt and destroy the movement. As you said, Justin, it had its roots in the Garvey era, pitting organizations and groups against each other. I mean, we always have internal conflicts, but you never know just how much that exacerbation might be coming from elsewhere. I remember in the trial of Geronimo Gijaga Pratt, member of the Black Panther Party, the Panthers were at each other's throats. Huey Newton and folk could have come to the aid of Geronimo because they knew he was at a Black Panther Party meeting at the time, but again, because of FBI machination. So all of this has kind of been continuous. And I'm glad about that, the volume book that Robert Hill is done, but I'm just curious now, we are in the 21st century now. I know that this petition was filed in 2016. What's happening now? Why is it important? What can people do? People becoming woke, you know, Black Lives Matter and all like that. How can Garvey and everything that you've done to bring this, you know, as far as it's gone, how can we bring this through to fruition?
I'm actually very optimistic that this can be successful. There has been a long time effort to move through Congress a declaration of Garvey's innocence. There was a hearing that took place in 1987. John Conyers and Charles Rangel in particular was a longtime advocate for Garvey's exoneration. Now the mantle has been picked up by Yvette Clarke in New York. And we have once again sent a request for the Biden administration to consider this exoneration and pardon. And what your audience can do is to help directly advocate for this pardon, and they can contact me or they can contact the White House directly. I can tell you that the White House is listening, especially to organizations. If you work with any organization, especially a Black organization, it can be the NAACP, it can be a local organization, whatever organization you work for, see if you can get that organization to write a letter, contact me, and our goal would be to have 100, 200, 300 different organizations voice their support and express the importance of the exoneration of Garvey, not just for the fact of his, his family, which should be enough in of itself, but for all of us to know more about his legacy, to redeem his legacy. Right now, there are people in the world who still think Garvey might have been guilty of those crimes. And we have an opportunity to forever fix the record and to make history accurate, and to do so in the lifetime of his children. One of his children recently passed away.
Yes.
And Dr. Julius Garvey is still survives in his 80s. And this would be a wonderful thing to happen during the Biden administration. We were very disappointed that the Obama administration did not take it up. Now we have a vice president with Jamaican heritage. We have a lot of different things that, as you said, Nkechi, the stars have aligned. This racial reckoning. If you're able to recognize Juneteenth, I don't see why you could not recognize the error and the evil of the frame up of Marcus Garvey, and help to rectify this wrong that has existed for over 100 years. We're coming up on 100 years since the conviction. So it is time to do that. And your viewers can send me an email, Justin Hansford.
How can they contact you, Professor?
Yeah, just my name at gmail.com, Justin Hansford, no stops at gmail.com. And they can get organizations. I will say that it's more likely that organizations advocating for the exoneration will make an impact as opposed to individual voices at this point. So whatever organizations you work with in your community, your church, your local city council members, whatever organization you work with, we would like to hear from all of them, and we can put together a dossier, so to speak, of many organizations that want to see the exoneration.
So, Professor, let's definitely connect with respect to that, because I have a lot of ideas brimming out of my brain right now, how we can really make sure that this happens and make sure that it's systematized. I really thank you for all of your work that you've been doing all of this time. You used to be a young person, and now you're getting up there now.
He was grazing here now. Yeah, time is flying. Yeah.
All of your work. Thank you so very much. And we hope to make this exoneration a reality. It is past due. As Marcus Garvey says, up your mighty race, accomplish what you will.
That's right. All right. No, it's a pleasure. And I'm a big supporter of you, Nkechi. Your book is being featured there behind you. So I hope the audience grabs a copy, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you so very much.
Okay.
Peace.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Wow. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Black Power Hour. I really want to thank our guest, Dr. Julius Garvey, Ambassador Attalah Shabazz, Professor Quito Swan, Chair Goulda Downer, Dr. Melvin Foote, Congressman Kwesi Mfume, and of course, Professor Attorney Justin Hansford. You can reach him at justinhansford@gmail.com for more information about Marcus Garvey. I love me some Marcus Garvey. I mean, I'm telling you, BOP TV, Black on Purpose TV, Marcus Garvey talked about buy Black. And that's what folks need to do, listening audience. You need to really talk to your family and friends and your neighbors and your colleagues to subscribe to Black on Purpose TV, BOPTV.com. That's what Marcus Garvey was all about. And I want to also say that I talk a lot about Marcus Garvey in my memoir, Black Power, Black Lawyer. He greatly influenced me. My grandfather was a Garveyite, and I talk about that in my memoir as well. I also talk about him in my children's book, Young People, My Shining Legacy, the story poem called The Mighty Marcus Garvey. That book will be coming back in print. So I would like to conclude today's Black Power Hour with a game. Once again, the immortal words of the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey: one God, one aim, one destiny. Up, you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will. This is Nkechi Taifa, host of the Black Power Hour. Till next time.